My name is Mia Bennett. I'm a geographer and a blogger, and today I'll be taking you along a little bit of my journeys into the Arctic and into the North. So when we think about the Arctic, a lot of us are probably familiar with stories about the region quickly changing due to climate change. Sea ice is thinning, the Greenland ice sheet is melting, permafrost is thawing. There's a lot of environmental changes going on that are quite dramatic. But in my research, what I've been more interested in thinking about are the people who are being affected by not only climate change, but also the massive effects of globalization and technological change in the region. And in my journeys across the Arctic, I've been very curious about talking to people, but I found that equally they're often very interested and curious about who I am as well. So to take a step back and kind of look at the Arctic, first of all, from space. So a lot of us have also probably seen these satellite images of the Arctic sea ice shrinking over the past several decades. But we can also use nightlight imagery, which James really explained well for us, to look at these communities of the 4 million or so people who live in the Arctic. So we can see here that the Arctic is not a very brightly lit place. We have the North Pole at the center, where nobody lives there. The only real bright points of light we can view are the lights in Siberia, where there's a lot of oil and gas extraction, in northern Norway, which is perhaps the most urbanized part of the Arctic, and the bright lights of the North Slope of Alaska, where there's major oil and gas development. If we broaden out the picture further, we can see the lights of the three major continents in the north come into view. So you have the lights of Europe here, Asia, and North America. And bringing out the picture even more, we can start to see all of the lights of the three continents now coming into view. And from this perspective, it perhaps makes a little bit more sense why these three major markets might wish to be connected by shipping routes that they perceive, that actors in these countries perceive as opening up due to a shrinking ice cap. So you have the Northern Sea Route, which could potentially connect countries in Asia to Europe by a shorter distance than the Suez Canal. And also the Northwest Passage, which, given appropriate infrastructure investments in ports and melting, thinning sea ice, you could also connect the markets of Asia and Europe that way. But while we see these maps of shipping routes kind of flowing across the Arctic in this seamless way, I think it's important to think about the ramifications of these developments for the people who live there and how they are already connected and not connected to the rest of the world. So you might be wondering, well, why am I, someone from California, born and raised, interested in this very far north part of the world? And I guess I could say, if I think about it, it starts with my interest in learning more about my family's heritage, which goes back to Scandinavia. So when I was an undergrad here at UCLA years ago now, I studied abroad in Sweden for one summer and learned the Swedish word for cold things like soft serve ice cream and ice and all the things like that. So carrying on with my interest in Scandinavia, the next summer I did an internship at the US Embassy in Oslo, Norway. And this was in 2008, and this was the year in which Arctic oil and gas was really starting to become a hot topic. So the sort of geopolitical importance of the Arctic as a region of new interest for a lot of the world's powers kind of came into my mind as I was a political science undergraduate student at the time. So I went back to UCLA later that year, and I was more interested in continuing my studies and research into the Arctic. So trying to figure out ways I could do that, I saw a call on the internet for by an organization that was looking for an Arctic blogger. And I thought, well, that's something I'd like to do. You know, as a teenager, I'd written blogs on the internet, and I wanted to explore the Arctic in more detail. So I applied. Turns out I was the only applicant. So I had my opportunity to start blogging about the Arctic, even though I was a complete novice. And it was really this opportunity that opened the door for me to eventually travel north of the Arctic Circle for the first time as a graduate student. So the blog led me to graduate studies, I could say, and the first place I ended up north of the Arctic Circle was again in Norway. So this is now just a few years ago, and I had gone to a conference, my first academic conference, where I presented some research on South Korea's activities in the Arctic. And after the conference, I had a few extra days, so I was walking around these incredibly beautiful islands in northern Norway called the Lofoten Islands. These are massive granite peaks that kind of just jut out of the blue Norwegian Sea. And as I was walking around here, I noticed these wooden fishing racks. And these are kind of a centuries-old tradition of hanging cod from the resource-rich Norwegian Sea onto these wooden racks to dry. And this cod was then exported to many parts of Europe and even to Africa as long as 500 years ago. But thinking about how even this practice has continued but also changed into the present. In another town I visited in these islands, I spoke to these men who were hanging bits of cod and I asked them, well, what's going on here? Can you tell me a little bit about what you're doing? It turned out that these were Lithuanian migrant workers who told me that they were hanging the most or the least desirable part of the codfish according to Norwegian standards. And these cod heads would be ground up and dried into protein powder that would be shipped to Nigeria. So in this moment, I was really struck by how globalized many parts of the Arctic already are, and how deeply connected they are to global circuits of labor, of commodities, and of capital. So I wanted to think about that further as I was moving into PhD studies. I wanted to know, well, is Norway kind of unique, or are there other parts of the Arctic that also are very deeply connected? So throughout the course of my studies and travels in the north, I've had the chance to go to places like Alaska, our American Arctic, where I met this 7-foot-tall man on the right here, who basically when he was young, he just decided to drive it from Florida and try and make it big in Alaska. He ended up becoming the state's largest private property landholder and also one of the largest collectors of mammoth tusks in the world. And he has a lot of interesting stories, one of which is that there's so much mammoth meat essentially lying in the permafrost that he dug some up and barbecued it, tasted like shoe leather, so he put some ketchup on it. I don't really know what I thought about that, but just kind of interesting characters you meet in the Arctic too, who often come from other parts of the world. I also had the chance to go to Greenland and work on studies onto the rivers that appear every summer on the ice sheet with Professor Lawrence Smith of UCLA Geography, some of you might know. So they're hard at work studying the climate change that is occurring on this massive island. But I found myself more fascinated by what we were eating for dinner. So here, this is just a plate of muskox Thai curry. So muskox is this big woolly buffalo that lives in Greenland. And the only restaurant in this tiny town we were staying in was run by a chef from Thailand, who decided he would combine recipes from his homeland with basically one of the main mammals you can find on land there and make this really tasty dish. Of course, you could also get Coca-Cola. So again, we're seeing kind of globalization coming together at work in the Arctic. But what I really wanted to know at the end of the day was, okay, if all of these places are connected, what about northern Russia? This is maybe one of the most remote parts of the Arctic, is northeast Russia, and particularly villages in the Republic of Sakha, which on this map you can see it's a very big region, the largest one in Russia, in fact as large as India. So I traveled to this region not too long ago for the first time, and I traveled there on a tiny plane, which was one of the most terrifying 2 hours I've ever spent in the air. Oops. But you know, we landed eventually, so I made it in one piece. And what I found when I got to the city of Yakutsk, which is the capital of this region, it's actually a very dynamic city of about 300,000 people. It's the coldest city on Earth, and it's so cold that the plumes of steam coming from the heating in winter, they can't go upward. They kind of turn horizontally for atmospheric conditions that you're probably better off asking a scientist to explain. But just kind of beautiful scenes I saw, and also kind of still a sense of maybe being a little bit in a different time. So you have these kind of monuments from the Soviet past, and men walking in flat-topped fur hats. But equally, you have these buildings in the background that are new housing developments being built by Asian investors in this city, which is actually closer to cities like Beijing than Moscow. And as I went into different schools and spoke with people there, I noticed that there wasn't really any anti-Americanism among the people. They were really interested in learning about me. So these school children here, they had never met an American, and they wanted to know, especially me coming from Los Angeles, what are palm trees like? Have you seen celebrities? What is it like to live near the ocean? This being one of the most landlocked places on Earth. I also found that there's a lot of other communities in the Arctic, even in this part of Russia. So there was a major Chinese market in town that was largely staffed by undocumented Chinese workers who had migrated about 3,000 miles up from the Chinese border to this city in northern Russia. And here they are selling Russia-China grinder boots, so pretty much on with the combat boot trend as well. So you can kind of see this just interesting dynamic here, but I found that these people were a lot less willing to speak to me, perhaps due to their undocumented status. And if I think about the journey that these people made to get to the Arctic, they probably, if they came in winter, would have had to go across an ice road that's several kilometers long on top of the frozen Lena River. Because Yakutsk is one of the world's only major cities that has no overland connections to the rest of the world. So in many ways, Yakutsk is still a quite remote and isolated city, even though it has these other connections going on through people and culture. But if we think about Russia, when we think about the Arctic at large, there are actually other surprising connections to the region that aren't necessarily connecting people, but are in fact connecting resources. So what you see here is the world's largest open pit diamond mine. And this was built almost 6 years ago now by the Soviets. And there's a city that's sitting on the edge, almost being swallowed up by this massive pit of that was once soil and diamonds. And in fact, if any of you have diamond jewelry, it might very well come from this region of Russia, which contributes about 1/3 of global diamonds to the world supply. And this has been going on for decades. Even during the Soviet period, diamonds were sent to the main auction houses in Belgium. Today we have landscapes in the Sakha Republic that are being prepared for oil and gas surveying and extraction to the major markets of Asia that are on the southern border of Russia. So you see flying across the taiga these vast lines that have been cut through the forest that we might imagine as untouched and pristine. It's really not the case. And what's already happening is, this is just 30 seconds of outside of a train window I was on along the Trans-Siberian Railway, where you can see enormous amounts of timber being shipped out, likely to be put into furniture or buildings or whatnot. In fact, a lot of IKEA furniture that might be in your homes is made out of timber from Russian Far East forests. So just thinking about the ways in which these commodities of the Arctic are already part of our daily lives, and what our demands for resources are doing to the Arctic, and not only to its resources, but to the people who depend on them. So as I'm continuing my research and thinking about how global changes are affecting the people who are living there, I constantly am reflecting on not only our uses of non-renewable resources like oil and gas, but also renewable resources, whether it's seafood that a lot of us are consuming from the North Pacific and the North Atlantic, or whether it's the timber that you just saw in our furniture and chairs. And when we use these resources, I'm thinking about, well, this woman selling her fish at a market in Yakutsk, will she still have fish to sell in the decades to come? And also, will it still be cold enough for her to be able to sell these fish standing up vertically? It's about -40 degrees here, and she just stands all day in a little rug of rabbit skin. So thinking about these climatic changes as well, and how they'll affect just the daily lives of people living there. So when we're thinking about the Arctic, I think here we're often in Los Angeles, say in the US, thinking about the region as a place of man versus nature, and of humans kind of conquering this big open space and putting in, say, these efficient shipping lines to connect Europe and Asia and North America. But I think we have to reflect upon, well, these shipping lanes aren't just going through empty space. There's 4 million people, at least, who are living there, people from all over the world who live there, not just people who are reindeer herders, say. So it's a dynamic region and one that's constantly in flux, but I think we can't think of it as an empty space. And hopefully I've been able to shed a little bit of light on what life is like up in the north. Thank you.